Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback and enjoy the story. Oxen, looking at it in surprise, said that she did not remember her buying anything. After examining the box, Yuki said that it was suspicious that the courier did not leave a receipt. Wang smiled with envy, looking at her colleague, and thought, who knows what kind of strange thing there is, maybe it will suck you into another world. Yuki turned to the courier and asked who the sender was. Peng, with his back to the girls, began to walk away when Yuki shouted that she had asked a question. The guy ran as fast as he could out of excitement and, without turning around, shouted that the client had not introduced himself. Having run around the corner, Peng stopped and, leaning on his knees, lowered his head down, trying to catch his breath. The guy looked up with a smug smile and, breathing heavily, said that he had done it successfully. Lu, standing opposite him, leaned against the wall and said with annoyance that the whole office heard him. Peng, breathing heavily, smiled and suggested that the gentleman entrust such matters to Zexer next time, because for him it is as easy as shelling pears. Looking at the guy seriously, Lu told him to stop complaining and asked if he had consulted with Yanyu and what they finally decided to give. Peng looked up at the gentleman and, laughing contentedly, replied that he had bought something amazing. Madame Yanyu analyzed our goal very carefully, and for such simple girls, combining positions to feed the family, like her, any luxurious things would be completely alien, so they tried to think simpler, because it was practicality that she should like. Yuki, sitting in the office at her desk, with a curious look on her face, tore off the yellow tape that sealed the package. Opening the box, the girl put her hand into the paper filler. Yuki took out an elegant black box with a gold clasp and a brand name on the lid. Frowning, Lu asked if they had really settled on the sapper's shovel. Suddenly, he turned his surprised gaze to the direction from which a cry of admiration was heard. Yuki jumped up from her seat and raised her hand, which was holding oval glasses, and cried out with joy that they were very beautiful. She lowered her head, asking herself if this was a gift for participating in the drawing and if she was really that lucky. The girl put new glasses on her reddened face. Suddenly she cried out with joy, saying how clear everything was, and the surrounding colleagues turned around in puzzlement. A man in a brown suit with a half-buttoned shirt with long black hair pulled back entered the office and, with his hands in his pockets, asked with displeasure why Yuki was making such a noise at work. Did she really want to lose her bonus this month? The girl looked back at Director Zhang in fear. Tilting his head, the man asked in surprise why the thrifty Yuki suddenly decided to buy herself glasses. The girl, smiling awkwardly, put her raised palms forward, saying that this is not so. Suddenly, Director Zhang sharply approached the worker with a dirty look, saying that today was the first time he noticed her cute face. The frozen girl asked if he was mocking her. With his legs spread wide, Zhang left the office, shouting for Yuki to pull herself together, since she would soon have lunch with Director Li. Smiling maliciously, the director said that whether they would enter into an agreement with him or not would depend on her. Yuki froze in horror. Wang, standing nearby, sipping a drink from a pink thermos, said with contempt in her eyes that their preoccupied maniac had changed his target, and she just wanted to tell everyone on the internet about him. Looking at her colleague, Wang crossed her arms and said that there was no need to look for excuses, because their female colleagues did not even wear lipstick, so as not to attract his attention. Yuki bit her lip. Looking forward tensely, the girl said that you shouldn't talk about him on the internet, because if you accuse him, you could end up without a job, and she thought that it was difficult to find such a well-paid job now, and Wang advised her to be careful. High-rise buildings touched fluffy clouds. Entering the luxurious establishment, Director Zhang laughed and greeted Director Li, who said that he would have to spend money today. Hugging the frightened Yuki, Director Zhang introduced his secretary with a smile, saying that she would meet him in person later. Squinting, the man with short black hair smiled lewdly as he looked at the girl. Li raised his hand with his thumb pointing up and, laughing, said that Zhang was lucky to have such a handsome secretary because business is a serious matter. Yuki frowned, thinking that this man was even more annoying than her boss. Zhang leaned towards Li's ear and, covering his mouth with his hand, began to whisper something to him with a dirty smile on his face. Sitting on the sofa, Director Li extended his hand to the girl and, laughing, told her to sit down and tell her about the contract. Peng looked furiously at what was happening with veins bulging on his face, saying how much Li pisses him off. The guy turned in shock at Mr. Lu, who said not to hold back. Looking at the book, Lu said that his employees should not be bullied by such people and told him to do what he had to do. Patting the spot on the sofa next to him, Lu called Yuki, who was standing calmly, to sit down. Looking down at the girl with a grin, Zhang hurried her along. The black-haired man stared at Yuki. The girl in the tight suit began to sink onto the sofa. The man put his hand under her buttocks. Peng's pupils shrank with hatred. The girl looked at the man in surprise. Zhang opened his mouth in shock. Li's hand and fingers were twisted in an unnatural position. The man opened his mouth in horror, and beads of sweat ran down his face. He threw his head back and raised his legs, screaming in pain. Zhang's eye twitched and he asked, screaming, how it happened that he broke his arm. The girl opened her mouth in puzzlement, not understanding anything. Lee clenched his teeth as his face dripped with sweat. Everyone sitting in the restaurant looked at the man and he shouted to call an ambulance. Peng looked at him with contempt and asked that although this gave him pleasure, it was not too cruel. Holding a gold pocket watch in his hand, Liu bowed his head and said indifferently that such people do not need hands. Heading towards the exit, Peng looked back at the screaming men. Yuki looked up at the guys leaving. Kang blushed with embarrassment. The girl opened her mouth in surprise. Looking at the retreating back of the guy in the black suit, she thought that this was the courier and asked herself if this was a coincidence. Peng's voice was heard on the street, saying that the gentleman seemed to have noticed this girl. Liu lowered his head with a smile and said that such a capable and modest girl is ideal for the Immortality Club, asking what Peng thinks about it. The guy opened his mouth in admiration without answering. Looking ahead, he said that there was indeed more and more business at the club, and some little things required their own specialist. Liu, taking out his phone, chuckled, saying that specialists are getting busier. The guy put the phone to his ear. Suddenly his expression changed. Looking ahead in horror, Liu asked when this happened. The building of the Immortality Club was illuminated by the sun. Looking at the monitors, Robert said that they lost contact with 2 members of the Falcon Squad while they were tracking down the volunteers. He carefully checked the equipment, but did not find anything strange. Besides, there are no communication obstacles in the range, and he has a suspicion that another organization must have noticed them and decided to retaliate. Liu tensed when he heard this. The guy approached the blonde and, leaning over him, asked where they were last time and if there was any camera footage. Robert quickly ran his fingers over the keyboard. A blue loading bar appeared on the screen as the blonde said that numbers 2 and 3 were last seen in Lulan County, Nation R on June 17th at 8:38 a.m. In the video, a man in a special suit was running down the corridor after another man. Robert said that their target was the Dr. Tsuchiya, who sells human organs, and they needed to stun him and get him out of the hospital. In the recording from the second camera, the man stopped, raising his hand. He pointed around the corner, saying that he would go there, and the second number made a gesture saying that he understood. The man rushed away. He ran around the corner and the corridor was empty. Suddenly, another man in a formal black suit and white shirt flew around the corner, falling headfirst onto the floor. Suddenly, the recording was interrupted and the screen was filled with noise. Raising his eyebrows, Liu asked in shock what happened. The blonde man, looking at the screen in horror, said that the Falcon Squad was supposed to report every 30 minutes, but they not only did not communicate, but also completely disappeared from the radar. Turning serious, Liu asked if they had sent an emergency signal. Numbers were running across the blue screen of the monitor. Robert answered in the affirmative and said that he would now conduct a deep search, but not every hacker could cope with such a level of protection. Turning his frightened glance at the gentleman, the blonde said that there was a very strong organization behind this man. Liu became angry, frowning. His mouth twisted and he said that he would never leave the people from the Immortality Club. The guy with contempt in his eyes said that they would see how many brains they had. A white plane was flying across a cloudy sky. On the tablet screen was Robert in a red hoodie, saying that he did not expect that Tsuchiya had such a powerful organization behind him. In appearance, Tsuchiya holds the position of head of the surgical department and is privately a representative of a financial group in the pharmaceutical field. A man with stripes shaved on his head looked intently at the tablet screen while the blonde said that this financial group had committed numerous crimes over its century-long history, and the right to sell organs was undoubtedly given to him by the top. Zhang raised his head with a frown as the guy said that number 2 and number 3 had definitely attracted their attention, and he was afraid that this did not bode well. Weiwen, who appeared on the screen, entered the conversation and said that she thought they still had a chance. Looking at the girl with flowing dark hair, Zhang asked what her guesses were. Weiwen opened her violet eyes and said that the influence of the Immortality Club is now spreading throughout the world, and the world's secret organizations must have already found out about them. The man looked at the tablet, from where the girl's voice came from, saying that their advantage lies in the secret of Mr. Liu's identity, and little is known about their essence. Peng turned around. Number 2 and number 3 are muscular men who have undergone long-term time acceleration training, and the condition of their bodies has long been different from the bodies of ordinary people. There was arrogance in Peng's eyes. Liu, crossing his legs, sat with a dissatisfied face. Zhang frowned angrily. Weiwen said that such organizations that specialize in experiments on the human body will not kill them so easily, at least until they learn the secrets of their bodies. Number 2 and number 3 will be safe. Zhang stood in the corner of the cabin, holding a tablet in his hands, and Peng sat on a black box, lowering his head down and listening to Weiwen, who said that now is the best opportunity for them to go rescue them. Using the time, on the plane they will not be able to cross the border of the country R, so they must parachute in advance, and the acceleration of the master will create inertia, with the help of which they will go to them. Robert on the blue screen with a serious face said that their route and coordinates of the evacuation point had been sent to their laptop computer, and if they had questions, it was better to ask them now. Peng, looking down, turned to the gentleman. Turning his head towards the tablet, he asked what the rules were. Robert turned to Mr. Liu, waiting for an answer. Frowning, the guy with glasses shouted that the rules were not to leave anyone behind. Gritting his teeth, Peng replied that he understood. Clouds floated across the blue sky. In an empty, brightly lit room, a man sat in the middle. His hands were handcuffed behind his back. A guy with brown hair and a bare torso looked down. The round door of the room rose up, and behind it stood 3 silhouettes. The guy raised an angry gaze at those who entered. An elderly man with dark round glasses and yellow pants with suspenders named Ishida stood in the company of 2 identically dressed men. The short-shaven man looked at Ishida and said in Japanese that the information they received from this man depended on him. Ishida, looking at the guy in front of him, replied that there was no problem. The prisoner said with a grin that he could not understand a word of the noise they made, and, laughing, asked why subtitles could not be made. With a joyful face, the guy shouted that it seemed like he remembered one phrase of greeting. The men turned to look at him in surprise. The guy mockingly uttered the Japanese word meaning they were fools. A man with long hair pulled back into a ponytail slammed his fist into his face. Looking at the guy who had fallen to the floor, the angry man clenched his fist. He turned around sharply when he heard the order to stop. Ishida, lowering his head, said that he did not want to watch how blood was shed. Bowing to the muscular men in black sweatshirts, Ishida told them not to worry, he himself would sort everything out and teach him sense. Frowning, the 2 men looked at each other. Putting his hand on the guy's shoulder, one of them lifted him up with a chair. Ishida grabbed the brown-haired man's face with his hand. The hand tightened, covering his mouth, and the guy looked at the old man in fear. Ishida remained silent with a concentrated face. Moving away from the guy, the old man turned around and asked first to let him get ready. The 3 men walked towards the round door. The brown-haired man frowned angrily without saying anything. The door began to lower, and Ishida turned to look at the guy. The brown-haired man was left alone in the middle of the huge room. He frowned at the door and remained silent. The corners of his lips were turned down. His chin lifted as he did something with his tongue in his mouth. He took out a golden key and held it between his teeth. Frowning, he wondered what this old man was doing. An image of Ishida with his hands clasped behind his back appeared in his head. Workers push a cart down the corridor. The 2 men were wearing masks. The small man, who was dressed like a surgeon, was followed by 2 guards. The man with glasses fell into a stupor. 3 black silhouettes were visible upon entering the room. In front of them sat a guy whose hands were handcuffed. One of the doctors opened him was Nabu Ishida. He was a specialist in neurology. 2 years ago, Inhumane brought him to this place. Nabu closed his eyes and looked down. He said there was no way for him to escape. Unfortunately, no one had used the key before him. The guy with brown hair looked in his direction and asked if he wanted him to take it with him. The surgeon and the guy stood in the open room where the bodies of the workers lay. Nabu said that Tsuchiya does whatever he wants here, and the guy wants to oppose him. The surgeon said that, also, judging by his physical condition. The man looked through his glasses, beads of sweat dripping from his face. He said that there must be something amazing behind the guy. The guy with brown hair stood with a thoughtful face. He was thinking about whether he could trust Nabu. After all, this place should be familiar to him. Isn't it better to bring him to his boss? The weather was clear over the forest. The guy said that time is ticking. Support is on the way. Sounds could be heard through the trees. The guy in a black suit was running through the forest. He stepped on the ground with his gray boot and wondered if they had received his message. The man looked back in horror as they shouted at him to stop or they would shoot. The bullet hit my leg. The guy's face showed how much he was in pain. He fell to the ground. 3 black silhouettes with weapons stood between the trees. One of them said that let him know what it means to be alive. The man said that he needed to be returned to their base. The guy in the black suit was in shock. He realized that it was all over. The man hid behind a tree when black silhouettes began to look for him in the bushes. Soldiers in gray masks walked with weapons. The man showed half his face from behind the tree. A group of mercenaries began to study the area. 2 masked soldiers stood nearby, and one of them told him to be careful. The soldier turned his gaze towards the sound and saw his comrade being killed. A second later, a bullet also hit him in the head. The black-haired man was shocked when the mercenaries began to hide behind the trees, shouting that the enemy was attacking. The machines did not stop working. The masked soldiers began to die one after another because someone started shooting at them from behind. The man began to look fearfully from behind the tree. Dead bodies of soldiers lay on the ground. 2 black silhouettes with weapons were visible from the smoke. Jiang and Peng stood with weapons. It was clear from the guy's face that he was glad to see them. Big metropolis. There were people sitting at the station. The main character in the glasses was with Robert. The guy with yellow hair took out his phone. He looked at Lu's back and said that a message had been received from Peng and Jiang. They got into a small firefight. Number 3 is safe. Robert said that they must have already arrived at the secret headquarters with the Falcon squad. The protagonist had black glasses on his face. He said that with the information provided by number 3, it would be possible to determine the exact location of number 2. Lou told the guy to tell them that he would be there too, and so that they do not make hasty decisions. A drop of sweat was dripping from Robert's face. He said that he could not convey such a message to them, something more concise was needed. The main character stood with his back and told him to stand in front of the other. Lou smiled and told the guy to stand in front, that the hacker has arrived. All buildings were screened. Deep tunnels and complexes. The main character said that they needed to dig up information about the enemy. A muscular man in a black t-shirt stood with his back turned. A second later, he flew away from the blow of a guy with black hair. It was clear from his face that he was tired. Suddenly, the guy yelled and said that he could defeat 10. Black silhouettes of people stood behind the glass. They did not understand how much energy there was in it. His physical characteristics are much higher than those of ordinary people. The man with the black tie told his subordinate to get the lab ready. He will cut every muscle of his with his own hands. Nabu was very surprised and said that this guy is his best example. If a man kills him, he will become a pile of useless meat. The man with black hair looked to the side and asked what he said. The man in the suit looked at Nabu and said that he seemed to have forgotten something. A drop of sweat dripped from the bald man's head when the director said that he was currently only a hostage of his Tsuchiya clan. The man strained his eyes and asked Nabu if he was sure he had the right to argue about the uselessness of the Tsuchiya clan's legacy. The man with glasses stood tense when the director asked where he got such confidence. The man with the tie walked away from Nabu and said that before he becomes the head of the clan, the surgeon will show him the results of his research. The man with a crazy smile said that Nabu could be his next test subject, and he told the guy to be taken to a cell. There were many prison cells along the corridor. The guy with black hair looked at the black silhouette, who asked, "Is he up to something?" On the other side of the bars stood Nabu, who said that he saved his life again. The man with black hair folded his hands and said that he was grateful to the surgeon. Nabu grabbed the bars and said that Dr. Tsuchiya is the devil. If the guy doesn't make a decision, they'll die. They have too little time. The guy smiled and asked Nabu what he knew about time. The surgeon stood with a surprised face when the shirtless guy said that this pervert was interested in his body. There was a rat lying in the corner of the cell. The guy said that who knows how long the surprise would be waiting for him. In a dense forest, a tent and cars were deployed where the light barely penetrated. There was equipment in the tent, behind which Robert was sitting, and he happily rolled his eyes, clenching his fist, noticing what he found. Lu Lai stood next to Robert, resting his hand on the table, and looked at the monitor. Lu Lai asked Robert if he could hack the data. Robert happily opened his mouth and told the main character that he had succeeded. Robert knitted his eyebrows and looked intently at the monitor. Robert told the main character that the information about number 3 is very accurate, and ordinary trading companies do not have such a degree of protection, noting that there is an image. Ishida stood near the bars behind which number 2 was. Ishida told number 2 that Dr. Tsuchiya is the devil and they don't have time. Robert exclaimed that it was number 2 and he was still alive. Lu Lai closely watched what was happening on the monitor, pursing his lips. Number 2 asked Ishida what he knew about time. Lu Lai leaned closer to the monitors. Robert opened his eyes wide and opened his mouth slightly. Lu Lai asked Robert who the person next to number 2 was. Robert's glasses reflected the open windows on the information monitor. Robert told Lu Lai that this was Sin Ishida, 88 years old, who was once an authority on neuroscience and also worked as a visiting professor at Tokyo University in charge of neuroscience research. Robert looked at the information excitedly. His mouth parted. Lu Lai raised his head and pursed his lips. Robert said that the subject of his research was human evolution. Number 3 lay on the couch, his face scrunched up in pain, while his leg was bandaged. Peng stood nearby with his arms folded and watched number 3. Robert said that the Ishida article stated that, with all the effort, the average adult only uses 33% of their muscle fibers, and a professional athlete uses only 42%, and the rest of the muscles are at rest. Robert imagined a man's pumped-up hand, clenched into a fist, with bulging veins. Robert said that if a person could use 100% of his muscles, his strength would be equal to that of Superman. Robert raised his eyebrows and turned to Lu Lai, saying that however, after publishing his article, Ishida suddenly disappeared, and it seems that he is working for Dr. Tsuchiya. The time trader broke into a malicious smile and eagerly looked at the monitor. In the thick forest, Zhang shouted and ordered the soldiers to line up. The soldiers stood in formation and looked ahead with serious faces. Zhang, with his eyebrows furrowed and his mouth wide open, turned to the main character and told him that the guys were ready and he could give the order. The soldiers looked attentively at the main character, standing in line. Lu Lai told the fighters that the main purpose of their mission was to save their comrades, while at the same time ensuring their safety. Lu Lai smiled slightly, flashing his black glasses, telling the fighters that Ishida needed to be brought to him alive. The black silhouettes of the fighters stood opposite the silhouette of the Time Trader. Robert leaned out of the tent with a thumbs up and told Lu Lai that the network in the target area had been captured and that area would be sealed off within 5 minutes. The main character smiled maliciously, baring his teeth. The Time Trader extended his hand and a yellow energy light formed in his hand. The Time Trader said 20 seconds would be enough. The fighters' eyes lit up red. The black silhouette of Lu Lai stood opposite the fighters, eyes flashing with yellow light, and wished them a successful hunt. The city seemed to stop, turning black. Mitsunari raised his head up, looking at the ceiling, noticing with displeasure that the air conditioner was not working. Mitsunari lowered his head, looking to the side and bared his teeth, saying that they couldn't even replace the board, but only knew how to earn money, swearing that they were shirking work again. Mitsunari bared his teeth angrily and looked ahead. Behind him stood a man in a business suit who told Mitsunari to calm down. Mitsunari noticed that they were underground and said that they wanted them to suffocate. Mitsunari opened his mouth in surprise and looked towards the elevator. The sound of it moving was heard in the elevator and it opened on their floor. Mitsunari raised his hand and pointed towards the elevator, telling those who went up that they shouldn't be there. Mitsunari and the man behind him were killed instantly. Zhang and the other fighters rushed down the corridor, their red eyes shining. The dispatchers were in the observation room. One of the dispatchers turned to the other and asked if his internet was working because he could not contact the underground watchman. The dispatcher pressed his fingers on the equipment, saying that his 2 was not working, noting that he had a bad feeling. The dispatcher looked at the monitor, saying he would contact security. The dispatcher raised the microphone to his mouth, opening it wide, telling security that this was the dispatcher and they should switch to the backup channel. The guards lay dead on the floor, staining everything with blood. The dispatcher kept telling the guards to go to the backup channel and for them to contact control or they should go on alert. Security guards on another floor ran in a crowd towards the fighters, armed with firearms and wearing masks. The guard, not expecting anything, suddenly widened his eyes. The guard was attacked so quickly that he didn't even have time to notice anything. In the control room, the screams of the guards could be heard from the equipment. The dispatchers were horrified, their eyes wide. The dispatchers looked at each other, their eyes wide in panic. One of the dispatchers said something had happened. The alarm turned on, turning red. Ishida raised his head, looking at the alarm, not understanding what happened. Number 2 smiled maliciously, baring his teeth, and said that Dr. Tsuchiya will be very surprised. Ishida knitted his eyebrows and was stunned by what was happening, that number 2 had already come for him. Ishida was thrilled that the fighters rushed in so quickly, noticing how fast and efficient the organization was. Ishida widened his eyes, thinking that he could get out of there. The guards' weapons were lying on the floor. One of the guards was sitting on his knees, all wounded, and raised his head, looking at the fighter, asking who he was. In front of the guard stood the black silhouette of a fighter, with eyes emitting red light. The fighter looked at the guard with detachment. In an instant, the guard was killed by a fighter. The walkie-talkie hissed in his hand. The guard looked at her, his eyes wide. Dr. Tsuchiya furrowed his eyebrows and rested his hands on the table, noticing that no one was getting in touch. The security guard stood next to Dr. Tsuchiya, telling him that armed troops had infiltrated the facility and they were the only ones left. Dr. Tsuchiya widened his eyes in shock. The security guard narrowed his gaze and said to Dr. Tsuchiya that reinforcements should arrive within 3 minutes. On the forehead of Dr. Tsuchiya's veins bulged with anger. He pressed his lips together, thinking that this was some kind of joke, that even the defense of the Doctor clan. Tsuchiya could not withstand even one invasion. Dr. Tsuchiya bared his teeth, looking down with contempt. Dr. Tsuchiya was at a loss that his comrades came for the test subject, saying that this was nonsense, because people from the head patrol were under his command. Security guards stood in front of Dr. Tsuchiya, looking at him with a serious expression. One of the guards narrowed his gaze and suggested Dr. Tsuchiya clear the facility, because the enemy's strength exceeds human boundaries. Dr. Tsuchiya began to slam his fist on the table over and over again, and showed his teeth, clenching them furiously, saying that this was simply unforgivable. Dr. Tsuchiya widened his eyes, causing them to become bloody, and remembered image number 2. Dr. Tsuchiya wondered how they could create superhumans before them. The guard stared at Dr. Tsuchiya, clenched his fists. Dr. Tsuchiya narrowed his eyes and lowered his eyebrows, telling the guards that they needed to find the test subject and leave. The guard looked at Dr. Tsuchiya, frowned, and asked what to do with Ishida. Dr. Tsuchiya looked from under his brows at the guards, knitting his eyebrows. Dr. Tsuchiya bared his teeth and looked angrily in front of him, telling the guards that people disgracing the Doctor clan, Tsuchiya, don't deserve to live. Dr. Tsuchiya looked at the guards with madness in his eyes and opened his mouth, telling them that he wanted to hear his last screams of horror. The guards lined up, accepting Dr. S orders. Tsuchiya, number 2 and Ishida ran down the corridor towards the exit. Ishida, slightly out of breath, opened his mouth slightly, asking number 2 if his comrades were strong like him. Number 2 opened his eyes wide and smiled maliciously, telling Ishida that there are guys who are more handsome in terms of data. Ishida had an idea and he widened his eyes, looking at the back of number 2's head. Ishida was surprised that number 2 was not the strongest. The round door from the corridor was closed. Ishida walked up to the door and leaned his hand against it. Ishida said that apparently Dr. Tsuchiya decided to clean up the facility. Ishida stood at the door, trying to figure out the password, noting that it was the only way out. Number 2 raised his head, arms outstretched, and noticed the entrance to the ventilation. Number 2 smiled slightly as he called out to Ishida and looked at him, asking if he was claustrophobic. Ishida turned around and opened his mouth, looking at number 2. Ishida raised his head, looking at the ventilation, and asked that he should crawl through it like rats. Number 2 closed his eyes slightly and smiled sarcastically, saying that they had no choice. The door suddenly began to move, and the guys turned their attention to it. A small gap appeared in the door. Ishida smiled widely and joyfully, saying that Dr. Tsuchiya couldn't think of a better password, noting that it was only 6 zeros. Suddenly, something pierced Ishida's shoulder, and he opened his mouth in surprise. Ishida looked at his shoulder, holding out his hand to it, and was very surprised by what he saw. Ishida pulled out a white dart from his shoulder, holding it in his fingers. The security ran into the corridor. Doctor appeared behind the guard. Tsuchiya was holding a gun in his hand and waving it. Dr. Tsuchiya told Ishida that it was a neurotoxin that he himself had developed, and he still had half an hour to enjoy the torment. Ishida looked at Doctor excitedly. Tsuchiya, who smiled bloodthirstily, baring his teeth. Number 2 turned around and looked at Ishida in panic. Dr. Tsuchiya broke into a crazed smile and widened his eyes, telling Ishida to die. Ishida was knocked off his feet and collapsed on the floor. Ishida's nose began to bleed and sweat dripped from his face. Number 2 turned to Ishida in fear, his mouth slightly open. The guards pointed their guns at the guys. Number 2 looked at the guard, baring his teeth and widening his eyes. Dr. Tsuchiya smiled contentedly and ordered the guards to kill the guys. Number 2 closed his eyes and clenched his teeth, thinking that now he would definitely die. Ishida was exhausted and blood was pouring from his nose and mouth. Dr. Tsuchiya smiled bloodthirstily and looked at the guys. Peng, in an accelerated state, attacked the guards, leaving behind only red lines. All the guards were killed. Dr. Tsuchiya stood in the middle of what was happening, holding his hands behind his back and wide-eyed. The guards suddenly fell to the floor. Dr. Tsuchiya was surprised, widening his eyes, not understanding what happened. Dr. Tsuchiya lowered his gaze, looking down and widening his eyes. Breast Dr. Tsuchiya was pierced through with a knife. Number 2 and Ishida were surprised at what was happening. Peng stood behind Dr. Tsuchiya, stabbing his knife into his chest. Dr. Tsuchiya widened his eyes in horror when he saw Peng's gloating smile and thought that he was a demon. Peng pulled his knife out of Dr. S. chest, Tsuchiya, and kicked him in the back. Dr. Tsuchiya fell to the floor, bracing himself with his arms and legs, and raising his head, begging for mercy, bursting into tears. The lifeless body of Dr. Tsuchiya fell completely to the floor, bleeding. Ishida sat on the floor next to Dr. Tsuchiya and looked at his body. Number 2 smiled broadly, delighted to see Peng, who was in an accelerated state, looking menacingly ahead with his lips pursed. Number 2 noticed that Peng was in this state and asked him if the big boss was with them. Ishida was on his last legs, bleeding, not understanding which big boss he was talking about. Peng noticed Ishida, looking at him with a serious look. Ishida somehow held on, breathing heavily. Ishida stood up slightly as Peng suddenly rushed towards Ishida at high speed, causing Ishida to get scared and back away. Sunlight filtered through the trees, slightly illuminating the protagonist's small base. Robert turned to Lulai and smiled widely, baring his teeth. Robert told Lulai that the Falcon Squad had sent a message that the mission had already been completed and they were on their way back. Robert looked at the main character with confusion. Lulai looked serious and looked at the floor. Robert opened his mouth slightly, calling out to Lulai. The fighters returned and were in the tent. Sitting in front of them was Ishida, who was slightly shaking. Ishida looked at the time trader from under his brows, barely holding on, and said that it seemed to him that he was in the kingdom of the dead. Lulai walked up to Ishida with a pathetic expression on his face, putting his hands in his trouser pockets. Ishida looked at Lulai with his mouth slightly open and asked him what it must be. He is the big boss. Ishida stood up slightly and moved forward, eyes wide, surprised that the time trader was so young, and that he had already managed to unlock the secrets of human evolution. Ishida became worse, coughing and blood began to spray from his mouth. Ishida told Lulai that he had a lot of questions for him, but he had no time left. Ishida smiled maliciously, baring his teeth, noting that he would die from his own poison, and it must be karma. Lu Lai walked up to Ishida and sat down on one knee, leaning slightly towards him, and smiled maliciously, narrowing his gaze. The time trader furrowed his brows slightly and looked out from his glasses to look into the eyes of Ishida, who widened his eyes. Lu Lai told Ishida that he seemed to know very little about time. A golden treaty appeared in the air with the image of a dial. The time trader pursed his lips and stared at Ishida, who widened his eyes in surprise and opened his mouth slightly. Ishida opened his mouth in surprise, thinking that this was the great secret of the power of these people. Lu Lai stood in a relaxed position, smiling slightly and looking at Ishida, recalling images of the people who work for him. Lu Lai told Ishida that his club has incredible minds, tough and strong soldiers, prudent advisors, and their goal is to create a beautiful world that will be the crown of the evolution of life, adding that he is lucky. Ishida looked at Lu Lai with his mouth slightly open and his eyes widened in bewilderment. The time trader knitted his eyebrows and narrowed his gaze, grinning maliciously. Lu Lai told Ishida that he was exactly what he needed. Ishida had a contract hanging in front of his face and looked at it in bewilderment. Lu Lai told Ishida to join them. The time trader smiled maliciously, narrowing his eyes, and told Ishida that this was not just a contract, but also his saving talisman. The time trader waved his hand in the air with a pathetic expression on his face, and information about Ishida appeared above his hand. Name: Shin Ishida. Age: 88 years old. Left to live: 4 minutes, 58 seconds. Lu Lai remarked, telling Ishida that in the end, he had nothing left to live. The time trader bared his teeth in a malicious smile, telling Ishida that he was not forcing him, and the choice was his. Ishida knitted his eyebrows, hesitating slightly. Ishida looked at the rest of his life, his eyes wide in panic. In Ishida's eyes, the black silhouette of Lu Lai sparkled with its menacing gaze and broke into a malicious smile. Ishida thought that the main character was able to change life expectancy and called him not just a man, but a god. Ishida smiled contentedly, baring his teeth, and said that it seemed he had no right to bargain. Ishida looked at Lu Lai from under his brows with a serious look, telling him that he was joining. A golden dial appeared in the air, the forest turned black and white. Robert sat with an irritated look. Lu Lai smiled benevolently. Ishida raised his palms and looked at them, puzzled. Ishiguro was surprised that the numbing sensation from the poison had disappeared. Ishida joyfully raised his hands up, clenching them into fists, and exclaimed that his body had come to life, and this was just a real miracle. Robert grimaced his face with displeasure, looking at Ishida, telling him to change the record already, since he was already tired of it. Ishida suddenly fell silent, pursed his lips and slightly widened his eyes, lowered his hands down. Lu Lai turned to Robert, smiling slightly, and told him that Ishida was now their colleague and asked him not to be so harsh with him. Robert turned to his computer with dissatisfaction. Jiang entered the tent with a serious look, showing his teeth slightly. Jiang told the main character that the guys are ready. Jiang furrowed his brows and opened his mouth slightly, telling the time trader that as soon as he gave the power, they would get down to business. Lu Lai turned his head towards Jiang and looked at him, not understanding what business he was talking about. Jiang told Lu Lai that she needed to cover her tracks. The main character raised his eyebrows and opened his mouth slightly, then smiled slightly. Lu Lai furrowed his eyebrows and smiled maliciously, telling Jiang not to bother as they would ignore it. Jiang was taken aback by what he heard and opened his mouth slightly. Jiang pursed his lips and turned behind him. Lu Lai smiled contentedly. Peng told Jiang that they should not be afraid to leave evidence, even corpses. Peng leaned his back against the tent at the entrance, folding his arms across his chest. Peng told Jiang that this could be a good intimidation tool. The time trader adjusted his glasses with his hand, smiling maliciously, and turned to Robert, looking at him seriously. Lu Lai told Peng that this was not a bad idea, noting that there was something, however, and turned to Robert, saying that he wanted him to destroy all the research data on the enemy server for all time. Robert raised his hand to his head, smiling wickedly at Lu Lai, and told him that he was a professional at this and would not leave a single hair. Lu Lai turned his head to the side and looked behind him at Ishida, asking him if he minded. Ishida raised his eyebrows and widened his eyes, then bowed his head, holding his hands on his knees, and thanked Lu Lai. The main character smiled contentedly, holding his hands in his pockets. Robert sighed dissatisfiedly, narrowing his eyes, telling Lu Lai that he was quick-witted. Huge white clouds floated over the dense forest. Lu Lai told the guys that they were coming back. Jiang ordered everyone to line up. The bright sun was shining over the city. White clouds floated above the Immortality Club building. Lu Lai walked along the corridor in a business suit, grinning contentedly. Waiwen told Lu Lai that it seemed that they were unnecessarily afraid of this problem. Lu Lai told Waiwen that not only did they not suffer any damage, but they also brought a professor of neurology with them, noting that the enemy's deal was unsuccessful. Waiwen smiled sarcastically, raising her eyebrows slightly as she looked at the main character. Waiwen told Lu Lai that as far as she knew, That organization was second-rate, and Professor Ishida was supposed to go to America to continue research, and they kidnapped him. Lu Lai smiled widely and his eyes sparkled, telling Waiwen, "What if we talk about Ishida? Then every cloud has a silver lining," adding that as soon as he sees Tang, he will immediately be inspired. Waiwen looked at the time merchant with a serious look, saying that even though his power has no limits, it is still in the future. Lu Lai interrupted Waiwen, turning his back, and asked her that she was afraid that he would become arrogant from success. Waiwen furrowed her brows and narrowed her eyes, telling Lu Lai that they couldn't even be sure that they were stronger than those people, and their level of technology could far surpass modern society in many areas. The main character squinted and smiled slightly, saying that there are too many secrets in the world. Waiwen lowered her head slightly, looking from under her brows. The main character told Waiwen that there is always a bigger fish, but for each there is a remedy. Waiwen walked behind Lu Lai along the corridor. Lu Lai told Waiwen that now they will find out what kind of fish is behind that organization. Waiwen looked at the time trader with concern and seriousness, telling him to remain vigilant. Lu Lai stood with his hands in his trouser pocket and smiled widely, telling Waiwen that he knew and would be careful. The sun illuminated the building of the Immortality Club. The fighters lined up in front of the main character in his office. Lu Lai sat at the table with his legs crossed and looked at the guys seriously. Peng furrowed his eyebrows and opened his mouth, narrowing his eyes. Peng told Lu Lai that the Falcon squad was assembled and they were now ready to take stock of the last mission. The projector turned on. Waiwen stood with a serious look, looking at the screen. The fighters watched what was happening on the screen, lined up. From the video, the command could be heard saying that Team A was ready to turn off the backup power and Team B was moving forward. Peng, Lu Lai and Zhang stared at the report playing on the screen. The video stated that the target had been located and that no one should be left behind, noting that they looked like snails. Waiwen watched the report with her mouth open in surprise and her eyes wide. From the video, it was heard that the north side of the corridor had been cleared, as well as the south side, adding that Team A was continuing to move. The spotlight stood on the table, displaying a picture on the screen. Waiwen stood in a stunned state. From the video, the groups were heard to turn their attention to the fact that the enemy was armed and that they clear the place as quickly as possible, adding that the location of number 2 has been found and Group A is moving on while Group B continues to search for the enemy. Lu Lai smiled slightly and looked at Waiwen, asking what she thought about it. Waiwen opened her mouth slightly and closed her eyes, knitting her eyebrows. Waiwen asked the protagonist for forgiveness, saying that she told him he was arrogant, but she didn't mean it. Waiwen opened her eyes and looked at the time trader seriously, continuing to say that the enemy's combat power was not even close to his. Waiwen leaned over with her eyes closed and told Lu Lai that she was too rough with him. The main character leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, and told Waiwen that her words meant a lot, because even according to mythology, the gods were destroyed by their arrogance. The main character opened his eyes and looked at Waiwen with a malicious smile, telling her that it was thanks to her that he decided to take stock and look at the results. Waiwen looked at the time trader with a relaxed face. Lu Lai held a gold pocket watch in his hands. The soldiers stood in formation with serious faces. The main character said that after all, if he didn't have the power, then his soldiers wouldn't have such an advantage with all their power. Lu Lai closed his eyes with his palm up and told Waiwen that she was not only reminding him, but the entire club to move forward with caution. Lu Lai opened his eyes and smiled contentedly as he looked at Waiwen, telling her that he was grateful to her for this. Waiwen didn't expect to hear this and widened her eyes, then bowed her head, closing her eyes, and told Lu Lai that it was her responsibility. Waiwen gazed at Lu Lai with a searching gaze. Lu Lai knitted his eyebrows and narrowed his eyes, his glasses flashing. Waiwen noticed that Lu Lai was no longer the same person she met the first time, and there was nothing left of his former tenderness. The fighters turned their heads to the side and looked to the side with a serious expression on their faces. Waiwen lowered her eyes slightly, looking down sadly. Waiwen thought that Lu Lai was now performing the tasks of a leader on his own, but she still had a feeling that while his powers were getting stronger, Waiwen imagined Lu Lai standing with his back to her, his hands in his trouser pockets. Waiwen thought that something was gradually disappearing in him, but could not understand what it was. Light from the window made its way into the office. Zhang told the fighters that if they messed around, they would go home, and told Lu Lai that if he was done, he would take the guys away. Lu Lai exhaled heavily and leaned back and closed his eyes, telling Dahua, Baoshan and Wang that they could come in. The guys entered the office, and Lu Lai adjusted his glasses with his hand, smiling maliciously. The guys looked menacing. Baoshan bowed slightly, holding his hands behind his back, and told Lu Lai that they had come to him with a report. Lu Lai slightly tilted his head and smiled as he looked at the guys, telling them that this time they showed up a few days early, and it looks like they are gradually getting the hang of it. Baoshan raised his head and looked at the main character with a serious look, telling him that last time they gained some popularity, and now they have clients. Lu Lai furrowed his eyebrows and looked at the guys seriously, saying that popularity is a double-edged sword, adding that he was afraid that they would not be able to keep everything under control. Wang smiled broadly, knitting his eyebrows, and told Lu Lai not to worry since each of their clients is carefully selected and they will not make a mess. Lu Lai grinned contentedly. The black silhouette of the time trader raised his hand and his hand glowed with golden light, saying that he wanted to look at the guy's results. The hands on the clock began to spin quickly. Lu Lai looked at the guy's results with a crazy look. Above each of the guys, information about them and their results appeared. Name: Zhao Dahua. Age: 46 years old. Left to live: 23 years, 9 months, 18 days, 23 hours, 30 seconds. Name: Wang Zai. Age: 40 years old. Left to live: 32 years, 8 months, 15 days, 15 hours, 22 seconds. Name: Gu Baoshan. Age: 55 years old. Left to live: 8 years, 7 months, 14 days, 9 hours, 12 seconds. Lu Lai smiled widely, baring his teeth. Lu Lai looked at the guy's results with a concerned look, thinking that this was what he needed. The weather was clear above the Immortality Club building. The main character was sitting at his desk, contentedly looking at the guy's results. Name: Zhao Dahua. Age: 46 years old. Left to live: 23 years, 9 months, 18 days, 23 hours, 30 seconds. Name: Wang Zai. Age: 40 years old. Left to live: 32 years, 8 months, 15 days, 15 hours, 22 seconds. Name: Gu Baoshan. Age: 55 years old. Left to live: 8 years, 7 months, 14 days, 9 hours, 12 seconds. The time trader narrowed his eyes and raised his eyebrows, smiling sarcastically, looking at the guys. Lu Lai told the guys that they had harvested a really good harvest compared to last time. The guys stood in front of the main character, bowing their heads, smiling contentedly. Lu Lai told the guys that their efficiency had clearly increased. Baoshan closed his eyes and told the time trader with satisfaction that they had become smarter. Lu Lai was surprised and looked at the guys in bewilderment, his mouth slightly open. Baoshan told the main character that they had united into an ardol. Baoshan turned his head towards Dahua, who smiled sarcastically. Baoshan told Dahua to let Lu Lai take a look. Dahua put lottery tickets on the table. Baoshan looked at Lu Lai from under his brows and grinned bloodthirstily, telling him that, like in a regular lottery, the buyer receives a cash prize, however, in return they ask for a few months of life. Lu Lai presented green banknotes flying in the air. Baoshan said that the value of the prize is different, so you can win a different amount. Lu Lai picked up the lottery ticket and looked at it with interest. Lu Lai told the guys that, however, regular lottery tickets are usually cheap, and asked them how they managed to convince people to play their lottery. Baoshan narrowed his eyes and looked at the protagonist with excitement, saying that they had set a reward amount that was not comparable to a regular lottery, and it was enough to crush her. Baoshan smiled sarcastically. Baring his teeth, Lu Lai widened his eyes in surprise and pursed his lips. Baoshan told the main character that, moreover, the chance of winning their lottery is 100%. Lu Lai imagined a crowd of black silhouettes of people raising their hands in the air. Lu Lai thought that compared to the millions they had spent before, they had created a business with the least cost and large income. The time trader put his hand on the table and looked at the guys with a serious look, pursing his lips. Lu Lai thought that the guys managed to pull off such a thing, and if you keep everything under control, you will get an excellent business with large sales and low costs, noting that it is professional. The guys smiled broadly and contentedly, their eyes widening. Lu Lai told the guys that they did a great job and let them continue in the same spirit, adding that he would take their idea into account. The time trader flashed his glasses and smiled bloodthirstily, squinting his eyes at the guys. Lu Lai told the guys to now give him the entire harvest. The guys raised their heads with caution and looked up. Lu Lai extended his hand forward and it glowed with golden light. Bright light filled the office. Lu Lai stood with his arm extended forward, glasses sparkling, golden dials appeared in the air. Lu Lai clenched his hand and bared his teeth, furrowing his brows. Green vines appeared from the guys' chests, glowing and heading towards the time trader. The time trader took the time collected by the guys, soaring in the air. The time trader looked bloodthirsty at his okay, smiling broadly and baring his teeth. Multiple hieroglyphs with numbers appeared in the air. Lu Lai grinned maliciously, his glasses flashing, telling the guys that he was done. Baoshan fell off his feet. Dahua and Wang remained on their feet, swaying slightly. The main character clenched his hand into a fist and looked at the guys with indifference, telling them that they had done a great job and very soon they would receive their reward, but for now they can rest. Baoshan rose to his feet and, closing his eyes, told the main character with a smile that they were honored to work for him, and they would do their best to share his concerns. The main character looked at the guys angrily. Baoshan did not expect this and widened his eyes in surprise. Lu Lai noticed with displeasure that the guys still had not left. The The guys left the main character's office. Dahua grabbed Bayashin by the shoulder, asking him if he was okay, noticing that he could barely stand on his feet. Bayashin looked down in panic, his eyebrows knitted together, and told the guys that honestly, every time the boss took away their time, he felt a sense of fear. Wang spread his hands to the side and smiled widely, closing his eyes, and told Bayashin that his sycophancy was not working, and told him to learn from him, talk less and ask unnecessary questions. Dahua looked at Bayashin with a slight smile and said that their boss was still an unusual person, noting that ordinary methods would not work on him. The guys walked along the corridor. Bright sunlight came through the windows. Wang told the guys that he knew a good restaurant and suggested that the guys go there because they needed to relax. Bayashin agreed and said that he turned pale. Lu Lai stood in the middle of the office, clenching his hand into a fist. Clenching his hand into a fist, Lu Lai looked at her with a malicious smile and opened his hand, which shone with a golden light. Lu Lai looked at the information that appeared in front of him. Name, Lu Lai. Age, 27 years old. Remaining to live, 10,032 years, 29 days, 12 hours, 20 minutes, 36 seconds. Lu Lai smiled bloodthirstily and looked straight with a mad look, thinking that he had finally managed to collect 10,000 years. A strong current of air appeared in front of Lu Lai, which began to suck him in. He raised his hand in front of him, covering his eyes and squinting one eye. Lu Lai up that there was no one in the office. Weiwen was very surprised, her eyes widening and her mouth parted. The white dial floated in the air, the hands on it were spinning at incredible speed. Lu Lai floated in the space of the river of time, widening his eyes in surprise, noticing that he was drawn into the river of time. Lu Lai looked worried, his eyebrows furrowed. Lu Lai's gaze was full of indignation. He did not understand how to use it correctly. The time trader straightened up in space and stood up, leaning against the invisible floor. Lu Lai noticed that the flow had stabilized. Lu Lai looked around in space and unexpectedly noticed green bubbles. Lu Lai thought that, however, he felt his time being consumed, and this time he must find a way to turn back time, adding that he could not allow time to be wasted. Bubbles surrounded Lu Lai, and he looked at them with confusion. The bubbles showed events that had already happened before. Lu Lai noted that these are events that have already happened once, and besides, these are the most important events of the club. Lu Lai stood with a serious face, his glasses flashing, and then he grinned mischievously. The main character thought that he needed to figure it out, and he is in the club building, but time goes backwards, and all the events in this building also go backwards, until they return to the starting point. It was sunny above the building. People were walking up the stairs. In the corridor stood the doctor and Zhu Yang's wife, who looked at the doctor with a pitiful look and begged him to save her husband. Lu Lai looked at the memory bubble with pursed lips and knitted eyebrows. The doctor told Zhu Yang's wife to stop, because this would definitely not help anyone. Lu Lai thought that it looked like there used to be a hospital there and didn't understand who these people were, thinking that he would see great historical figures. Zhu Yang's wife sobbed pitifully and furrowed her eyebrows, telling the doctor that he must save her husband and begging him. Zhu Yang bowed down in front of the doctor in tears, and Lu Lai looked at all this in amazement. The woman said that the doctor is Jiang Sai's only hope. The doctor waved his arms and ordered the woman to get up from the floor. The main character's eyes widened when he heard about Jiang Sai. The protagonist sweatily looked at the floor, confused. He thought that Mr. Jiang Sai was a famous entrepreneur who had built many universities. At that very second, Lu Lai smiled sarcastically and extended his hand forward using his timing skills. He realized that he was exactly where he wanted. Lu Lai lowered his head, frowning slightly, and tried to teleport. At that same second, he changed his location and found himself in a different place. Lu Lai put his hands in his pocket and looked around at the new place. He saw that he was in the right place. Unknown people in black suits and others wandered around the large white corridor of the hospital. Lu Lai found himself at the transition between the corridors and looked around at the people. He noticed that this place used to look so interesting, where every brick here seemed so familiar to him. Lu Lai realized this was the Peng Gym, which used to be a morgue. The main character looked to the side with a slight grin. He thought about Yunuo and what her father had achieved. That same woman wandered around the hospital and buried her eyes in tears at a man in a blue robe. Lu Lai understood that his father was a respected businessman, so he didn't understand how he could contact these people. The man tried to calm down Zhu Yang, saying that her husband had been operated on and nothing could be done for him yet. Lu Lai frowned sarcastically and smiled slightly. He realized that he had found his goal and thought that television series did not only show all sorts of nonsense. A small closed area for the production of goods. Jiang Sai, later known as Jiang Sai, grew up in poverty and created his own business from scratch. After all, he once headed the family business and then mastered 20% of the world textile trade. Men in black suits and hats, cigarettes in their teeth, wandered through a cloud of dust. Lu Lai understood that the terrifying success of this businessman not only attracted competitors, but also gave rise to envious people, and they began to hunt him. The elderly man with a beard was Jiang Sai. This businessman tried in his own way to save a poor and backward country. A guy in a black suit was hiding a knife behind his back. Lu Lai understood that Jiang Sai got involved with the villains and was brutally killed. A black silhouette stood in the cemetery. The hatred was gone, and his son, despite all his love for his homeland, became just a shadow of his father. The same man in a blue robe who was trying to calm the woman with black hair was the son of a businessman who stood with his eyes closed. Lu Lai, in the form of a black shadow, looked out through the doorway, which led into the chamber where the half-dead old man lay. The protagonist understood that the level of medicine at that time was lagging behind. Lu Lai looked with contempt and expressiveness at the immobilized body of the old man who was lying unconscious. Lu Lai understood that even though there was not enough money at that time, the hospital could prolong the old man's life in this way, thereby torturing him. Lu Lai's steps were heard in the ward, and he began to move closer to the old man. Luckily for him, Lu Lai pointed out that this was just history that needed to be rewritten. Lu Lai looked down with a malicious mockery, emitting white light behind him. The old man was lying in the ward on a cot, covered with a white blanket and unconscious. The old man began to come to his senses and gradually open his eyes, examining the situation around him. The old man saw in front of him the black silhouette of a man, who was Lu Lai. Lu Lai extended his hand and spread his fingers using his time management skills. The main character stood arrogantly with his hand outstretched to the side, and Jiang Sai's biological life clock appeared. Age 73, left to live, 1 hour, 11 minutes and 50 seconds. The old man looked forward in horror and looked at Lu Lai's gloating face, realizing what was happening. Jiang Sai realized that these were the remains of his life. Lu Lai noticed that the old man understood everything correctly because this was his life expectancy. The main character gritted his teeth and ironically noted that Jiang Sai had 1 hour left to live. The old man looked at the maliciously smiling Lu Lai with numbness and despair. Jiang Sai thought that this was a messenger of death. Lu Lai asked the old man if he had any regrets. The old man squeezed out the words from his lifeless body that he regretted only one thing. Lu Lai looked with expression at the old man, who lay with his eyes closed, and remembered his country. He regretted that the country was still weak, and because of external and internal troubles it was destroyed by criminals. The old man talked about a country that was not like a country, that was not like home. Jiang Sai pointed out, "Why not ask him about it?" Lu Lai frowned sarcastically and widened his eyes, noticing about the whole of China. The main character stood on the exhausted body of the old man and listened to him carefully. Lu Lai turned to the venerable old man, telling him that in fact he should not be sad about this, because even though the road ahead was difficult, however, the descendants will always be the first to rush into battle. The old man looked with horror and amazement at Lu Lai, who reasoned great. The time trader said that after 100 years, only ruins will remain of the rotten past. Lu Lai smiled sarcastically and frowned at the old man, who looked into his eyes with concern and anxiety. Lu Lai continued that in place of the past there will be a superpower and a generation to be proud of. Lu Lai arrogantly took out his magic gold watch that can control time. Lu Lai, with one hand in his pocket, said that he was a time trader and he could bring Jiang Sai back to life. The old man lowered his eyebrows and looked at Lu Lai with depression. Lu Lai was standing in front of the future school at the same moment. The old man asked about Lu Lai's strength. The protagonist adjusted his glasses and said that the descendants of the old man will build schools, and those talents that grow within the walls of the libraries of educational buildings will continue to build schools in 100 years. Lu Lai confidently noted that the old man had only to follow him. Lu Lai lightly touched his face with his hand and looked at the frightened old man with arrogance. The main character told Jiang Sai that he can grant him immortality, and when the time comes, he will be able to see with his own eyes the huge changes in his homeland. Lu Lai lowered his head slightly and looked forward expressively. The time trader noted that the road ahead still has some bumps. The time trader stood in front of the old man's bed with his hands in his pocket. Lu Lai asked Jiang Sai if he dared to witness all this with his own eyes. Lu Lai looked at the numb old man boldly and confidently, realizing that he would still be able to take his toll. The old man opened his mouth slightly and remarked in bewilderment about the 100 years that Lu Lai mentioned. Lu Lai extended his hand and held his golden magic watch in it. Lu Lai pointed out to Mr. Jiang Sai that no matter what he chose, he would still be dead by then. The time trader looked contemptuously at the old man, who looked at him in horror in response to the statement he heard. Lu Lai leaned his body against the wall and, with his hand raised, twirled the gold watch in his palm. Lu Lai said that the old man might think about his proposal, but not for long, since he had little time left anyway. The old man looked confused and did not understand where to go, as he felt pressure on himself. Jiang Sai looked at Lu Lai dejectedly and asked him what would happen to his family. Lu Lai stood unwaveringly at the wall and waited for a clear answer from Jiang Sai. The old man looked ahead sadly, sitting on his bed under a white blanket. He noted that since ancient times the problem of loyalty to the state and respect for the family has remained unresolved, so he must die. The old man lowered his eyebrows and humbly looked at Lu Lai, feeling broken and in pain. Jiang Sai replied that the messenger of death stole 100 years for him and wanted him to do something for Lu Lai. Lu Lai looked at the old man with displeasure, realizing that he was a time traitor, and left the old man no choice. Jiang Sai looked into the void with a devastated look. He noticed that Lu Lai could hardly be useful if he needed money. Lu Lai smiled sarcastically and noted that he did not need the money. The old man widened his eyes and looked at Lu Lai in a daze. The time trader noticed that his plan included the point that the old man would continue to live. Lu Lai lowered his head and straightened his red tie with ironic ridicule. The main character noticed that in 100 years he would need Jiang Sai's talent in his field of business because he wanted the old man to join his eternal club and help him create a completely new world. The old man grabbed his white sheet and squeezed it. Jiang Sai replied that instead of dying so easily, he wanted to watch his ill-wishers and enemies die. The old man looked with enthusiasm and hatred at Lu Lai, who was awaiting a decision. The old man really wanted to get even with his enemies, so he said that Lu Lai's plan must come true. People of that time calmly walked along a Chinese provincial street during the daytime. In the hospital corridor, people were walking around their offices as Jiang Sai's wife cried to the man. His wife cried into his vest sobbingly when the man said that there was nothing he could do to help his father. Suddenly, someone's steps were heard in the corridor. Jiang Sai's wife, with tears in her eyes, and the man turned towards Jiang Sai, who greeted his wife, calling her an old lady. The rejuvenated Jiang Sai came closer and looked at his wife with a joyful expression on his face, putting his hands behind his back. Jiang Sai asked his wife not to make such a sad face. Jiang Sai smiled sarcastically and closed his eyes, slightly knitting his eyebrows. He added that there was no need to be sad over some old man. The stunned nurse and Jiang Sai's wife looked at the rejuvenated and full of strength Jiang Sai. His wife widened her eyes and did not believe what was happening. She ran up in sweat and horror to her satisfied and grinning husband. She waved her arms to the sides in shock and did not understand how he became so younger and fresher. She did not understand how he became like this and considered him a ghost. With the light and peace on his face, Jiang Sai grabbed his wife's hand and placed it on his cheek, to prove that he is a living person. Jiang Sai said that she can touch him and understand that he is definitely human. Jiang Sai's frightened wife and the rejuvenated old man himself looked at each other with opposite emotions. She didn't understand how this was possible, but Jiang Sai decided to defuse the situation. Tears of joy and despair flowed down his wife's cheek. Jiang Sai immediately extended his hand to her face and wiped away a tear. Jiang Sai hugged his wife, pressing her to his chest. The beloved woman Jiang Sai opened her mouth and widened her eyes, from which tears flowed like rivers, because it was difficult for her to imagine that this was possible, and until recently the dying old man had turned into a rejuvenated, strong man. His wife grabbed his hands once more and pulled away slightly to look at her husband and see if she was crazy and if this could be possible. At that same second, she closed her roaring eyes and pressed herself against her husband's body. The black silhouette of the protagonist watched the reunited couple, who stood in an embrace. Lu Lai looked at what was happening with awe and warmth. At that same second, the time trader frowned and lowered his lips, clearly angry. Lu Lai sat on a bench in the park and looked around the expanses of the city of the past era in which he found himself. He understood that he could now calmly observe the era of that time. Jiang Sai walked along the embankment in a black suit and a black hat along with a suitcase. The lush green trees in the park absorbed the rays of the clear day. Lu Lai looked forward as Jiang Sai stood nearby. The main character noted that Jiang Sai had already prepared everything for the plan, noting that his wife would live to be 97 years old. The time trader added that when the time comes, he will allow Jiang Sai to visit his wife. Lu Lai and Jiang Sai decided to take a walk in the park. Lu Lai put his hands in his pocket and looked at the black silhouette of Jiang Sai, which was covered entirely in black. The main character noted that Jiang Sai should not return to his homeland until the right moment, noting that Jiang Sai should understand his plan and fears. Jiang Sai replied that he understood everything perfectly, calling him the messenger of death. A rejuvenated Jiang Sai, wearing an all-black cape, looked forward with a sense of humility. Jiang Sai noticed that this is why he goes on a long journey. Lu Lai looked sarcastically towards his now new transaction partner. Lu Lai replied that he would wait for him in 100 years in a time of peace and prosperity. Lu Lai extended his hand as a farewell to Jiang Sai. They said goodbye. Jiang Sai's black silhouette began to move away and head towards his mission. Lu Lai understood that for him Jiang Sai would be in a new era in just a moment. However, he would have to live a long life. The time trader looked at Jiang Sai, leaving him with detachment and bitterness. Lu Lai understood that time is truly a terrible thing. Suddenly, Lu Lai turned to the side at the strange sounds. A young girl in what looked like a military uniform took a photo of him with a shy expression on her face. The girl apologized for such an insensitive action, saying that she did not want to scare him because she just wanted to try out her father's gift. Lu Lai closed his eyes and broke into a malicious grin. He understood that he did not belong to this time and space, so it was difficult for him to say who could be truly frightened by his portrait, so he replied that everything was fine. Suddenly, the girls and Lu Lai's stunned gazes fell as the man furiously kicked the little boy, pushing him against the wall. The angry guy was screaming about how this little guy dared to rob him, noting that the guy seemed tired of living. A little boy, covered in bruises and beatings, covered himself with his hands while lying on the ground. He asked for mercy and begged not to beat him. Lu Lai stood behind the disgruntled girl, who told the bully to stop beating the boy. The main character, deciding to show his masculine nature as a protector, grabbed the hand of the girl, who looked at him questioningly. Lu Lai told her not to worry. Lu Lai frowned deeply and angrily looked forward at the unfair fight taking place. Lu Lai was going to punish the offender himself. The same guy who beat the boy looked at the main character with contempt and arrogance. The guy noticed that Lu Lai did not poke his nose into other people's affairs, and it would be better for him to worry about himself. The time trader tilted his head forward slightly and looked expressively forward at the bully. Lu Lai said that he would be the first person in this era to be killed. Suddenly, Lu Lai widened his eyes and felt something was wrong. Lu Lai's silhouette fell into the river of time, similar to outer space. Lu Lai didn't understand why he fell into this river again and why he came